My name is Randall Johnson, and I'm director of the Latin American Institute here at UCLA. And I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's event. And I'm particularly honored to be able to welcome Governor Bill Richardson to UCLA. Joe Garcia of the New Democrat Network, or NDN, will be introducing Governor Richardson in a few minutes, so I won't go into detail about his many accomplishments during his illustrious career in public service. He's been a two-term governor of New Mexico, U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Secretary of Energy, and former congressman, just for starters. We are particularly impressed by Governor Richardson's experience, his vast experience in the area of foreign policy, and his broad knowledge of Latin America, which is what brings him to UCLA today. As you may know, UCLA has one of the strongest programs in Latin American studies in the nation, with expertise across the disciplines, and from the social sciences to the humanities and the arts, and to the professional schools, and research on far too many topics for me to even begin to list here this afternoon. Our faculty is deeply concerned about relations between the United States and Latin America, and we look forward to hearing Governor Richardson's remarks this afternoon. But you didn't come here this afternoon to hear me, so I'll just say thank you to a few people and then step out of the way. I would like to thank a number of people and organizations for making Governor Richardson's visit to UCLA possible. First of all, I would like to thank the NDN, the National Democrat Network, for sponsoring this event. I would like to thank our friend and supporter, Jose Pepe Molina, for helping to bring the event to campus. And I would like to thank my colleague, Professor Jim Wilkie, from the UCLA Department of History and the program on Mexico of the Latin American Institute for all of his efforts in putting this event together. And now, without further ado, I would like to turn the program over to Professor Jim Wilkie, who will provide more information. Jim?
Pleasure to see you here this afternoon and to welcome the governor. We were overlapped in Mexico City at times and when he was growing up there, and his father was on the board of the university that I was studying at, Mexico City College. So we have a bond there. I don't recall how many presidential candidates in history have ever announced in advance or discussed in advance a plan, let alone a governor. I think when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was governor of New York, he was thinking about the presidency and not thinking about Latin America, and good neighbor policy came along later. I think the Alliance for Progress was announced by Kennedy later, during the presidency. But here we have, I think, one of the unique times in American history of somebody looking at the possible partnership, a new partnership for all of the Americas. And fortunately, we have a group of experts here who will respond to him. Maximo Langer from the School of Law is right here. And we have over here Edward Tejes, sociology and director of the program on Brazil. And we have David Hayes Bautista and Bob Stein of the Latino Center for Study of Latino Health and Culture. And I have several other people who are trying to get out of departmental meetings and get in here, including Robin Derby from History Department. So we'll see how many can arrive. And then we will, after the governor's presentation, we will hear from our panel of experts to introduce some thoughts or observations or questions, and then a question and answer with the rest of you. But I would like to introduce now Joe Garcia of the NDN, because he's the one who's going to make the presentation and give us some insights too, perhaps on the fact that Bush today, of all days, came out with a new Cuban policy, which is the old Cuban policy.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for hosting us here. It's been fabulous. always the Cuban on the stand is the Cuba expert, but rarely is it true of our success of being able to have an effective Cuba policy. Today, I have the great honor of introducing Governor Richardson, and I'm going to ask you one thing before I get started there. I'm going to ask you all to turn off your cell phones, which mine will probably go off during this, but just if you can. There are a few notables I want to mention. We have the Consul General of Mexico, Rubén Beltrán, with us. Thank you very much for being here. We have Senator Alex Padilla, who's with us today. Thank you, Senator, for being here. And we have Felipe Fuentes, who's with us, but more importantly, he's a Bruin alumnus, so I wanted to mention that. So, you know, when one speaks of Governor Richardson, one speaks about figures that embrace diversity in the person of Governor Richardson. He is the son of an American father and a Mexican mother, and he grew up in New Mexico. But he was born in Pasadena. He went to New England during his middle years, where he attended both high school and college. And he is a figure that embraces the spirit of public service. He has not only served as an ambassador, but he served as a congressman, secretary of energy, and now as a governor. And recently, when he won his second term as governor, he won by the highest percentage in the history of the state. He has earned laudable recognition for his efforts in freeing American hostages, helping American servicemen and political prisoners in North Korea, Iraq, Cuba, and the Sudan. And clearly he was a critical figure in the negotiations with North Korea and Sudan. He's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 4 times. As Energy Secretary, he set some of the most stringent standards for efficiencies that have saved taxpayers or consumers billions of dollars. And as governor, he cut taxes, and he invested heavily in education, and he continues to work being one of the leaders in renewable energy and environmental protection in his state. Without further ado, it is my great honor to introduce my friend, your friend, and the great governor of the state of New Mexico, Bill Richardson.
Everything Joe Garcia said about me is true. Es la verdad. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here at UCLA. I want to thank so many of you that are here. I know there are a lot of big shots that I'm going to briefly recognize. The Consul General, Rubén Beltrán, my great friend Joe Garcia, who's been a great voice on the Cuban-American issue for many, many years. The director of the Hispanic strategy at NDN, Dr. Wilkie, Randall Johnson, Dr. Stein. Where's Dr. Stein? Dr. Stein, Professor Telles. Where's Telles? David Hayes Bautista. Finally see you. I've read all your stuff, Bautista. Do you write it yourself? It's very good. Professor Johnson. Thank you, the distinguished members of the legislature that are here, my dear friends who have been introduced, the future of Los Angeles politics, of California politics. I want these 2 strapping assemblymen to stand up so you see them. Stand up and face the crowd. Felipe Fuentes and Alex Padilla. They're the new generation. I want to thank you very much for being here. Thank you to NDN for hosting us. Before I talk about Latin America, I want to take a few moments to talk about what's going on here in this state. I know these are very tough times for Californians. They're tough times actually for all Americans. The fires that have ravaged the state, they've ravaged the national consciousness. Brave men and women every day are working to end this devastation. Firefighters continue to risk their lives to protect the lives of their fellow Americans. And it is in this sea of destruction that we can see reflected the courageous will that defines our nation. We must each step up and do what we can. Yesterday, my campaign donated $10,000 to the Red Cross to assist relief efforts. I encourage all of you to give as much as possible, as soon as possible. I also ordered 2 strike teams of New Mexico firefighters to assist in protecting against the fire here. 10 emergency trucks, 42 New Mexico firefighters. And I know these fine New Mexico firefighters will reflect the very best of our state's firefighting tradition. And I was very pleased and honored to respond to your governor's request, along with several other states for that assistance. Please take care of my New Mexico firefighters. It is also very clear that we need, in the future, more air resources so that we can be better positioned to handle these fires and better prepared to handle any other crises. I recall in another disaster when I led an effort in New Mexico to help out victims of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. I remember going out to meet the first plane of refugees, and you can just feel so helpless in the presence of people that have lost everything. We did what a state can do. We too, as a state, have experienced the devastation and tragedy of huge wildfires. And we know well the toll it takes on families and land and water and communities. On a national level, I believe that we need to reform our military to ensure that our National Guard system is never stretched to the breaking point again. At the same time that I was ordering New Mexico firefighters to California, 300 of my state's National Guardsmen were deployed to Iraq. This is not what the National Guard was designed for. The war is leaving our homeland vulnerable to natural disasters. We have to end the war and get all our troops out as soon as possible. And as president, I will get all the troops out within a year after I take office. And I'm going to add 50,000 troops to the active duty Army and Marine Corps so that the Guard can protect Americans right here at home. Finally, we must honor the first responders who are fighting the fires right now. We must make sure that they have the best equipment, the best health care, and the best benefits for their families. They deserve nothing less. I would like all of us to stand up and give a thunderous acclaim to our firefighters that are protecting not just California, but our country. Please. Finally, I deeply believe that the coming days will prove that even the greatest natural destruction is no match for the hopeful will of the American people. We'll put the pieces back together. We will rebuild people's homes. And together I know we can do it. But today I want to talk to you about our foreign policy in our own hemisphere. It is painfully clear that the president's invasion of Iraq has wrecked our international credibility. It's damaged our alliances. It's emboldened our enemies. It's depleted our treasury. It's exhausted our armed forces and fueled global anger against us. The war continues to divert us from the real war against the terrorists who attacked us on 9/11. And it has undermined our ability to lead the world on pressing issues such as nuclear proliferation and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Less discussed, but just as important, is the great damage that Iraq has extended even to our own backyard in Latin America. President Bush's cowboy diplomacy has not just led us to ignore urgent challenges in our own region, but has alienated our friends in this hemisphere. As was so evident when the President toured Latin America last March, anti-Americanism is growing at an alarming rate across the region. Through neglect, we have turned many of our natural allies into fair-weather friends and outright enemies. The President once vowed to treat Latin America, quote, not as an afterthought, but as a fundamental commitment. But despite Latin America's economic and national security importance to the United States, he has neglected to engage the region. The policy of negligence is dangerous, and it cannot continue. We need bold action to repair the damage. The next president must have a clear plan for engagement and the experience to implement it. As president, I will focus on 7 strategies to rebuild our relationship with the rest of our hemisphere. At all times, we must preserve our faith in American values and renew our courage to connect with other nations. First, diplomacy. We must engage all Latin American countries diplomatically, including troublesome regimes like Venezuela. This does not mean making concessions. It means honest talk and tough negotiation. It means trying to find common ground where we can and strengthen our interests wherever we can. Second, we need a realistic approach towards Cuba. Currently, our policy with regard to Cuba has been static and reactive. What we need is a vibrant and proactive policy with economic and personal issues like trade and family visitation. President Bush has been imposing severe restrictions on family visits and remittances to Cuba. I strongly oppose these cruel and counterproductive rules. Cuban Americans should be allowed to visit their families, and they should be able to help them out financially. The Bush administration even denied U.S. Army Sergeant Carlos Lasso, who had won the Bronze Star in Iraq, the permission to visit his 2 sons living in Cuba. Imagine. That is appalling. Family values must mean actually valuing families. Furthermore, these restrictions bolster Castro's ability to portray himself as somebody that's standing up to the big bully in Washington. Put simply, these rules have been good for Castro and bad for Americans in Cuba. As president, I will allow unimpeded family visits and remittances by Cuban Americans to their relatives in Cuba. I will work with the Cuban American community to heal the bitter divide that inevitably cuts through this issue. Together, we can create a policy that is good for all Americans. And I'm ready to reassess the trade embargo in exchange for Cuba releasing all political prisoners and making positive moves towards democratic freedoms. Third, we should push for a Latin American country to have a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile are obvious potential choices. Fourth, human rights. We need to replace inflammatory, quote, regime change with real promotion of human and democratic freedom. Latin Americans admire American democratic values, but they know hypocrisy and they've seen it. That hypocrisy, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, secret prisons, torture, eavesdropping on our own citizens. Let me be clear. If I am elected president, I will be a president who follows the Constitution of the United States. And I will not only talk about human rights, I will be strongly guided by a strong faith in the universal value of human dignity. Fifth, fair trade. We must promote trade agreements that include strong and enforceable labor, environmental, and human rights standards. Free and fair trade can benefit both Latin America and U.S. workers. It'll benefit consumers throughout the region, and it will bind closer the nations of the entire hemisphere. Number 6, development. We must lead the hemisphere in promoting economic development and reducing poverty. In an interdependent world, extreme poverty in one nation is the concern of all nations. Strong and equitable economic growth in Latin America is in the U.S. national interest. It must be a priority. Those that think that we can keep poor immigrants out with walls do not understand the desperate will of starving men and women. Therefore, 7, we need comprehensive immigration reform that is realistic and humane, not without walls. We need to aggressively police the border, yes, punish employers who hire undocumented workers, but we must also recognize that we simply can't deport the 12 million who are already here. We need a fair path to legalization for the 12 million that are here. Our loftiest ideals are not inconsistent with our most realistic policy objectives. After so many years of a foreign policy that has ignored both principles and pragmatism, we need a new kind of realism. The new realism will go beyond the old balance of power politics of the Cold War. We need to understand that what goes in other countries affects us profoundly, and that skillful American diplomatic leadership is needed to meet the challenges of an age of interdependence, an age of global warming, of global terrorism, of global disease and pandemics, of the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We need to lead with skill and moral credibility across a wide range of economic, cultural, or political issues. Our future prosperity and security is tightly interwoven with that of all the people of the Americas. Venezuela is our 4th largest oil supplier, providing 15% of our annual oil consumption, CITGO. Mexico is the 3rd largest market of U.S.-grown wheat, corn, cotton, and soybeans. Small Central American countries such as Costa Rica, Guatemala, and Honduras are major suppliers of the fresh fruit Americans eat. And Argentina, Ecuador, and Peru are top 10 vegetable suppliers. The president just doesn't get it. He seems to think that Latin goodwill towards the United States is something that we can take for granted. He seems to think that our geography guarantees the fitness of our relationship. And he continues to believe that the region will somehow follow a nation that refuses to lead. They will not. In the absence of principled leadership from America, they will turn elsewhere, anywhere, to whoever steps up. President Chavez of Venezuela has had serious success nourishing anti-U.S. anger throughout the hemisphere. He enhances his own power by using our country as his whipping boy. Like his friend, President Ahmadinejad of Iran, he thrives on conflict and incendiary rhetoric. Make no mistake, his gains are secured at our expense. We need a president who understands international politics and knows how to respond effectively to lies and provocations. When I'm president, I will stand up for this country, not by returning insults, but by exposing distortions. We need to take leaders like Chavez seriously, not because they are truthful, they're not. We need to take them seriously because they're tapping into the real resentment against us, and then amplifying it for their own purposes. Across the world, the Bush foreign policy has intensified anti-Americanism and played into the hands of our worst enemies. The Bush administration's short-sighted, clumsy diplomacy has helped leaders like Chavez and Castro create an axis of anti-American nationalism across the region. With the benefit of Venezuela's oil wealth, Chavez has forged ties with leaders such as Evo Morales in Bolivia and Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. These 4 countries, Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, and Nicaragua, have formed a trade agreement that seeks to exclude and undermine America in Latin America. Chavez is reaching out to long-standing U.S. partners, such as Argentina. His trade and economic development proposals are filling the void left by our bankrupt leadership in the region. In recent years, Venezuela has purchased more than $5 billion worth of Argentine government bonds and other debt relief instruments. A few months ago, Argentina's president, Nestor Kirchner, met with Chavez and Evo Morales in Bolivia, where progress was made on a deal to ship more than $15 billion worth of Bolivian natural gas to Argentina. The Chavez method of checkbook diplomacy extends to the aid he provided to Peru following that country's catastrophic earthquake in August. Hundreds of people were killed, thousands more displaced. The nation looked to the United States for help, and yet it was Venezuela that responded with more aid than the Bush administration. We handed Chavez yet another public relations coup in the region. I focus on Chavez not because he is a problem in Latin America, but he is another symptom. The disease is arrogance. The next president must take a far more realistic look at what is needed to restore U.S. standing in our own hemisphere. We need a president who understands the region and can talk directly to all the players. And as you know, I can speak in Spanish when needed, even though my last name, mi apellido, is Richardson. That's supposed to be funny. Hablo la idioma de la diplomacia. You know, I know such engagement can work. I've sat down with Fidel Castro and negotiated the release of Cuban political prisoners and an immigration agreement. The Organization of American States has asked me to serve as special envoy for hemispheric affairs, to help renew relations with our friends and restart talks with our foes. Only serious dialogue on issues such as immigration and trade can lead to serious solutions and a serious relationship with Latin America. We must remember that preserving your popularity is no recipe for inspiring a nation, let alone a region or a world. I owe whatever success I have in bringing people together and solving problems to taking risks. Sometimes you have to lay things on the line to get results. I recall when one of my constituents was taken hostage in Sudan. He was an American journalist from the Chicago Tribune, and he was captured with 2 aides from the African nation of Chad. They were imprisoned in the Sudan on phony charges of espionage. I had no reason for them to be released. I had no optimism about their release. But the journalist's wife asked me to go to the Sudan and try to get them out. So I went. The dictator of that country, after very strong negotiations, al-Bashir, said to me, "You can have the American, but the 2 from Chad, they stay." At that point, I could have left with the American, satisfied. But I said, no, they all have to come out. It was not the easy choice, but it was the right choice. We went back into spirited negotiations, and I left with all 3 men. That was not a time for polls or political consultants, nor was it a time for political calculation. We cannot afford leadership that has not been tested. My colleagues in this race have my respect, but it's a simple fact that the next international deal negotiated by any of them will be their first. We also cannot afford another president who doesn't understand that stubbornness is not strength. Consultation with friends, coordination with allies, negotiation with enemies is not weakness. It is what you need to do to get things done. It is the basis for restoring America's international leadership. The Bush administration has missed too many opportunities to strengthen U.S. engagement. Over and over, the president has failed to address urgent issues, especially trade, development, and immigration. This iron triangle of economic concerns is tightly welded, and we need a comprehensive vision to tackle them. At its root, illegal immigration is an economic problem, driven by the fact that decent jobs for people in their home countries are not there. So long as other economies fail to produce jobs, people will continue to come here. As long as we have a monopoly on hope, we will be a magnet for the hopeful. If we want to stop illegal immigration, we need to promote equitable economic development in Latin America. There's no way around it. We need trade agreements that create good jobs in all countries, including our own, while promoting human and worker rights. We need a comprehensive immigration solution in this country, one that includes a path to legalization. Part of that, yes, is increased border enforcement with smarter technology and more guards. It works. But you know what won't work? The wall, la muralla. You know, Senators Clinton, Obama, and Biden were wrong to vote for that wall between the United States and its neighbors. They talk about change, but they voted for the most blatant example of old-style Washington solutions. Expensive, dumb, and entirely the product of political calculation. You know what? You know what the Congress did with the wall? They funded only half of it. What, just New Mexico and Arizona and not Texas and California? That's what they did. Anyone outside the Beltway can tell you how well half a wall works. What's next? Funding for half a dam? Half an airplane? Half a withdrawal from Iraq? You know, apparently the people in Washington who wanted to build a 12-foot wall have never heard of 13-foot ladders. We need new thinking in the White House, the kind that would never allow such a symbol along our border. If your Latin American policy starts with a wall between cultures, it will quickly collapse into rubble. We need new thinking in the White House on immigration, and we need boldness. Take action. Don't let the zealots on talk radio and others fill America with incendiary hatred. Unfortunately, the indifference of the Bush administration has enabled Chavez and others to convince many Latins that expanded trade with the U.S. is bad for Latin America. The good news is that there are real opportunities to build mutually beneficial trade and development partnerships with Latin American countries. We can have trade agreements that are good for workers, for companies and nations. Agreements that create jobs, that fight poverty, reduce the incentives for people to immigrate illegally to the United States. Other countries are already taking advantage of our missed opportunities. China's trade with Latin America has doubled in just the past 6 years. The United States needs to get off the sidelines and back into the game. It means jobs here in the United States and in Latin America. We also need to recognize that for many years to come, the U.S. economy will continue to attract Latino workers. While our laws say they cannot come here, our economy says they should. We need to be realistic. Our economy demands these workers, and it makes no sense to have them here illegally rather than legally. As we crack down on illegal immigration, we need to allow more legal immigration. We need a reasonable guest worker program and an earned path to legalization for those already here. And we need to work with the Mexican government to get them to stop encouraging illegal immigration and instead to start creating more jobs in Mexico, but as a partnership, because Mexico is a friend. We also need a more effective approach to the problem of illegal drugs. Recent action in Congress would reduce the emphasis on military intervention and would increase U.S. support for rural development, judicial reform, and law enforcement assistance programs. This is a needed step in the right direction. Our military cannot solve every problem by itself. As with illegal immigration, we need to recognize that drugs are a development and economic incentive issue. Law enforcement is essential, but not enough. To fight drug trafficking, we need to arrest and punish dealers. But we also need to fight the profitability of the trade itself. We need to do more to reduce demand at home with prevention, with rehabilitation programs, with substance abuse prevention. I learned this in New Mexico. As we shut down over 400 meth labs, reducing supply, we also undermine demand by providing quality drug treatment to break the addiction cycle. We must remember that a farmer who can make a living doing something legal is far less likely to choose drugs production. A worker with a good job is less likely to fall into the clutches of drug smugglers. Stronger Latin American economies will be less vulnerable to drug lords. Finally, we cannot truly engage Latin America if we do not include the 28 million indigenous people who live there. Too many indigenous people live in deep poverty, just like in our own country. Too many lack access to the essential services that others in their countries take for granted. Too many are ignored by their own governments. It is essential that our policies respect indigenous traditions and promote the rights of indigenous people. After years of neglect and missed opportunities, the President's trip last March to Latin America was too little and too late. The next administration must do better. We will need a renewed commitment to Latin America based upon engagement, dialogue, cooperation. We need equitable trade agreements and comprehensive immigration reform. Having spent a good part of my childhood in Mexico, having traveled widely in the region and known its leaders, I understand the complicated dynamics of inter-American relations. My Mexican mother taught me to value and respect our own culture, Latin American culture, just as my father made me so proud to be a citizen of the United States. My autobiography was titled Between Worlds, Entre Mundos, not because we are worlds apart, but because we are so close, and because it is so important that we work together towards common goals. Woody Allen once said that 80% of success is showing up. These recent years, we've not shown up in Latin America. Instead, we've been shown up by lesser leaders. That must change. If we do not attempt to succeed in the region, then surely we will fail. And moving forward, we must preserve the shared faith of the people of this hemisphere in the principles of human dignity and democratic freedoms. We must have the simple courage to be strong. We must step up and lead. Thank you so much. Muchísimas gracias for listening to me tonight.